At the request of Broadcasting and Recording Services, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting their mobile phones are turned off completely or switched to airplane safe or flight mode, depending on their device. It's not sufficient to just put your phones in silent mode, as this will maintain a level of interference in the broadcasting system. Item 6 on the agenda today is detailed scrutiny of the Local Government Water Pollution Amendment Bill 2018. I would like to welcome to today's meeting Deputy Martin Kenny. Before we begin, just a note on privilege. I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 172I of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence given to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to so do, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way to make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I would now like to call on Deputy Kenny to make his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Cathaoirleach, and I'm very glad to be here this morning to present this bill for the detailed scrutiny. First of all, when I got elected, I promised the people of my constituency to address their needs in the Oireachtas. The issue of depopulation, decreasing population in the North West is a long-term and insidious blight on our own county of Leitrim and in other parts of the region as well. There are many reasons for this. We need jobs, we need infrastructure, we need transport, but we also need to fight to keep what we already have and to hold what we have. This bill is designed to tackle a situation where young families who want to stay in rural Ireland but who cannot get planning permission to build their homes there. The problem lies in the nature of soil in the parts of the region and in parts of the southwest and in other parts of the country, but it's particularly bad in Leitrim and in West Cavan and in areas like that where we have very dense soil. In these areas, the present code of practice from the Environmental Protection Agency has virtually halted construction of one-off dwellings in areas with heavy soil. The nature of the soil means the standard T-test, the percolation test, will not be passed. Therefore, there must be a zero discharge according to the EPA code of practice, no matter how efficient the wastewater systems are. The achievement of zero discharge is impossible in these areas, and particularly in the climate that we have. But it is possible in this day and age to install a system which will mean that the wastewater produced will be to a bathing water standard. This amendment to the Local Government Water Pollution Act 1977 will allow the Minister to design and regulate a discharge licence, which would be issued by local authorities for one-off houses where the percolation test fails. The Government has acknowledged that rural Ireland needs rehabilitation after years of neglect and austerity. In my own area, I can instance dozens of young families who, for the refusal of planning permission, have not been able to settle in their home place where they want to live for the rest of their lives. If discharge licences of this nature were granted in an appropriate and proportionate way, there is no danger to the environment from this amendment. I truly believe that it is a good move for rural Ireland, and I propose this amendment in that spirit. Just to briefly, if you like, talk about where this came from and how we come to this situation. For many years in Leitrim we've had this problem. We've had a problem particularly of very dense soil and of being able to get planning permission in those circumstances, even before the new EPA guidelines. And throughout much of that time, the Council has tried to develop alternative ways of doing it, and for many years, probably for the past 20 years, almost all places where planning permission was being sought, they had to use mechanical treatment systems, and usually they had to go to a percolation area which would be of imported topsoil or a raised percolation. So this type of situation is something that the Council was trying to deal with long before the more stringent, if you like, code of practice came in. Now, one of the things that a lot of people in rural areas would be conscious of is that there is this mindset, a sort of that it's almost like someone described it to me as like an animal farm type mindset, you know, all two legs bad and all four legs good, that all houses that are in clusters are good and all houses that are on their own are bad. And I think that kind of mindset doesn't recognise the reality of the world we live in, and is a closed mindset, and we need to open that up. There are hundreds of parishes around the country where there are no towns, whether it's just people living in isolated rural communities. My own parish in Oireachtas in County Leitrim is similar to that. There's about 600 people living scattered in houses around the countryside. There's no town, there's no village. Yet we have a small 3-teacher school which, for the last 10 years, there's been practically no new houses built in the community, and there are at least a dozen families, a dozen young people who would like to come and live in the area, but they can't get planning permission to do so. And that school is now going to be a 2-teacher school next September, and probably within the next 10 years we'll see that school close. It's similar in another parish beside me in Drumreilly, it's similar in Gortlether, the other parish on the other side of me. And that's all over small rural areas in County Leitrim. People say, can't they go and live in the town? The nearest town is 7 or 8 miles away. You know, people who live in the rural community live in the rural community, and that's where they want to live. My own house, when you turn off the main road, I'm the first house on the left-hand side down the L1511. But I'm 2 kilometres down that road. So there's 2 kilometres of space between me and the main road. There's another couple of 100 metres to the next house. We're not talking about houses on top of each other. We're not talking about situations where you've got cluster developments or where you've got ribbon development or where you've got overdevelopment at all. We're not talking about that kind of situation. And of course, where that situation happens, appropriate planning needs to come into place for it. The issue, going back to what has happened in the past on the EPA guidelines, what Leitrim County Council done and other councils done where they had these kind of problems with heavy soils in the past is they developed other means of doing it. And I've come across many situations in West Cavan and Leitrim where people got planning permission where they put in reed bed systems to deal with the effluent, which was, if you like, a natural way of doing that. There is also, of course, willow beds as well, where willow trees are planted, and as the sewage comes in through them from the septic tank, the evaporation from the willows soaks up and deals with all the nutrients in it, and is a very effective way of dealing with that situation. There is also, of course, mechanical treatment systems that have been used an awful lot, and most of them do an excellent job as well. To come to the situation that we have in the new EPA guidelines, when they came in, I was on Leitrim County Council, and we found this situation where practically nobody in most rural areas in Leitrim were going to get planning. And I think it was actually Senator Pascal Mooney that organised a trip up here to Leinster House, and we met people from the EPA at that time and from the department, and they said to us, look, this was an unintended consequence. We never thought of a situation where we'd have this happen. However, we have it there now. We'll try and come up with a solution. And since then, Leitrim County Council and other councils around the country and the EPA have looked at how they can achieve zero discharge, how this can be done. And they've done studies into it. And one of those studies was a research paper which was done, report number 161, by Lawrence Gill. And that research paper goes through what and how these systems were looked at and examined. I've actually done a copy of the main points of it. I'll give it to the members afterwards. But just to go through a couple of things in that. First of all, the evaporation, it's a longer word, it's evapotranspiration systems, or ET systems for short, is what they call them. And those systems are where, when a septic tank goes in, the percolation area from that becomes, if you like, a shallow bed, where there's a large area dug out in the garden, where there's an impermeable plastic layer put into it, and then it's filled back with the soil, and the reeds, or the willows are planted in that then, and they're given a year to start to grow before the actual effluent comes in and goes into the bottom of that system. They work extremely well. In fact, in the system, they show that the evaporation from them, and it's in the conclusions of it, that the system using willow trees are unlikely to act as a zero discharge system. That's the problem we've got here, is the zero discharge. But the question I ask is, why does zero discharge the issue? The zero discharge was put in place to achieve zero effect. That's what we want to do. We want to get a zero effect, that it will not have any impact on the environment. The system that has been developed by the ET system, and it states also in the conclusion of the report, that it does promote excellent pollutant attenuation, and they significantly reduce the net discharge to the environment, and so should be considered as a viable passive treatment. The conclusion also states this would require a change to the current consent procedures to allow for such a controlled discharge to surface water. So in other words, the conclusion of the report done by the EPA states that the Willow ET system produces an effluent which is of similar quality to the effluent that comes from a system that has no sewage discharge going into it. So they found that it had zero effect. And if it has zero effect, the point I would raise is that we then need to look at why we have a zero discharge rule. So it is in that context that I presented this bill. In fairness, Leitrim County Council have also done more work on the ET system since then and are continuing to do that work, and have a pilot scheme in place where they're looking at minimising the amount of rainfall that was going into the system, because they found that they could achieve zero discharge for most of the year, but only in the winter time when you had heavy rainfall, and it was really the rain that was going out the other side of it rather than any pollutant effluent. So they're talking about building the willow beds and sloping it off so that as little rain as possible gets into it, to try and achieve zero discharge. My argument is, and I think it's a logical argument, that if we have zero effect, we have the same impact as zero discharge. If you take water from the river and you put it in a 40-gallon barrel and you kept it until night and you put it back into the river again, it's having a zero effect on it. And that's exactly what this does. It has a zero effect. So the bill, and I know there has been some issues raised by the department in regard to the bill, and I went through that and looked at it, and one of the issues that has been raised about the bill is that it would appear that it would suggest that the local authority must issue a licence under Section 4. Now, I went through the bill and I can't find the word must anywhere in it. What the bill states is that notwithstanding the generality of the foregoing, nothing in this section shall prevent the water system services from issuing a licence. So there's nothing to prevent, doesn't mean you must. Similarly, it says that the Minister shall introduce regulations to provide for the application for a wastewater treatment system. So he shall introduce regulations to do it, but he still isn't insisting that it must happen. It only happens when the person or the individual or the agent usually applies for a licence and they meet the standards required for that licence. The bill also states that the Minister may introduce such regulations as necessary, incidental or supplementary or consequential for the purpose of giving effect to this section. So in other words, going back to the Local Government Water Pollution Act of 1977, that this additional section in it, section 13 at the end of it, would do nothing to affect any of the other sections, and none of the other sections would affect it either. Basically, what we're talking about here is that the present system of issuing a discharge licence, which is in place for a situation where you have a large number of houses or where you have an industrial type unit, that would be a particular type of licence for that, and that's fine. But what I'm saying is that there also needs to be provision made for a different type of licence which suits for a single house in a situation where you have a system in place which will have zero effect and allow for the minimum amount of discharge. That's what we want to try and achieve. I know that others, including the EPA, including many of the local authorities, are working in a similar vein to try and achieve that. But the one little obstacle we have in the way is this issue of zero discharge. Now, if we wanted to, we could try and go back and change the code of practice. But changing the code of practice is a difficult thing to do, and I understand that because it has been lodged with the European Commission. So, but the code of practice states that if you fail to pass the T-test, you have zero discharge or you have a discharge licence. What I'm doing is putting in effect a means of having a small discharge licence in order to deal with that in an appropriate way where all other planning requirements are already met, and then you look at how you can achieve a zero impact on the environment, and that can be achieved by the type of ET system which has been developed by the local authorities in cooperation with the EPA already. So I leave it at that, and I'll take any questions that you have. Thank you.
Any members wishing to?
Chairman.
Okay.
You know, I'm here really to support the bill, or to support some system, or putting some system in place where people, and I know Leitrim was mentioned as well, but there are areas in counties like Winecavan and other counties where areas are dying really and surely, as Martin said, in schools and football clubs, all that, where rural people from certain areas cannot get planning because of this situation. And you know, we should, in all sincerity, try to bring in a system where people can be allowed to live in their own areas, where you have farming communities and farmers, young farmers taking over family farms and all that type of thing, that they cannot build on their own land. And I think what Martin is proposing is reasonable. What he's really trying to do is to allow a local authority to issue a discharge licence, providing that there's no pollutant in the discharge. That's really what it comes down to at the end of the day. And I know this is going on for some time, and it's a big issue in many places. And I think whatever we can do, we should try and do to try and facilitate these families. Not everybody can live in a town or a village. Some people have to live on the land where they farm the land, and it's not suitable to have to move away from there. And it's to keep local rural areas alive, quite honestly. That's what we're trying to do here. So I wish to compliment Martin on his bill, and just to say that we will be supporting that bill. Thank you very much.
Well, first I want to thank Deputy Kenny for coming in and presenting it, and with the passion he presents it. And as someone who lives in a rural community himself, he clearly knows and understands it. And as Deputy Scanlon said, you know, we must encourage and support people who wish to make the choice to live in rural communities outside the cities and the towns, but in a sustainable way and an environmentally healthy and responsible way. I think that's a key issue. I think that's important, and this is becoming an issue. And I think you make a very strong argument in your presentation here today. I'm aware that Trinity College Dublin, who I worked for myself in its School of Botany, so I know something of a lot of its work, both in biomass, in terms of willows and salixes, and now in relation to doing research in relation to this. And there is a pilot scheme, or there's certainly an ongoing body of work by Trinity College in relation to the use of willows and this particular scheme. You might know something of it. If you do, you might just share some.
That is Trinity.
Yeah. Okay. So all of that is in that. And how is all of that going on? And what stage is all of that at this stage? I'm not familiar with the ins and outs of the work, other than I'm aware that we're doing something on it. Because I mean, clearly, I think it's good that there is this partnership, and I get a sense that Leitrim County Council are proactively engaging in this. So you might just share some of that.
Yeah, well, as I said, the work that they've done into the ET system has been examined for a number of years now, and one of the I suppose objectives they had was to try and achieve a zero discharge. That was the logic that they were trying to go to, and they found that it was practically impossible as of yet to get zero discharge, mainly because of rainfall. Rainfall was the issue, not the effluent going into it, because a standard house, I think, has somewhere less than 1,000 litres between water and wastewater and everything going into the system every day, and they found that wouldn't have an impact. That was being dealt with. But when you take the rainfall as well on top of that, it caused the problem. However, what they did say, and I have it in the actual research paper. They say that the system is acting. We're acting as excellent pollutant attainants, even if they could not fully achieve a zero discharge system on an annual basis. So they couldn't fully get a zero discharge, but they could achieve a zero impact. And that's the point that I make. That the water that was leaving them, in actual fact, was equal to the water that was coming from a system which had not been fed any effluent. So the runoff from, we'll say, the concrete yard at the back of the house, if they took samples from that and took samples from the effluent that went through the ET system, they were equal. There was an equal amount of loadings of phosphorates or you know, they were well within any standard. In fact, there's one of those ET systems in a house that I know a man very well outside of Mohill, near Loughreen Castle Estate, and I was asking about it. He said, yeah, he said now and again they come when they take tests, and he got them to call him back, and they said the man that called him back after they'd done the test told them that the water was similar to bathing water standard, leaving it. So the zero effect is really what we need to achieve, and all of us want that. Nobody wants to pollute. Nobody wants to destroy our environment. understand that the water that we have in our rivers and have in our lakes often ends up in our taps because it goes back through the system. So we want to make sure that we have a zero effect on it. And nature, through the growth of willows or through the growth of reed beds and all of that type of system, is the best system that has been found to deal with these situations. So if we're able to, and this is the key question, I suppose, are we able to do it every time right? Are we able to make sure that we can come up with a system that will work at every site correctly, and that can be monitored and checked, and that it can be affordable? And that is the research which is now being done. But when that research is done, we come back to the problem at the end of it, that we still have this clause there, which, in fairness to the EPA at the time, said it was an unintended consequence, that zero discharge blocks even that. So even if we had a system which produced water that was potable water that we could drink, and it was only letting out a litre of it a day, because of the rigidity of the system we have at the moment, we're not allowed to discharge that water, which is a ridiculous situation under any context. So really what we need to do is we need to work with the EPA, with Trinity College, with Lawrence Gill and with the others that have done this research, and ensure that we can come up with a system. And like I say, everyone that's involved in this process to date are confident that a system can be found which will have zero impact. But it will not have zero discharge. It will have a level of discharge mainly due to rainfall. So once we achieve that, we then come back to the situation that we have the problem that the zero discharge rule is there, and the way to get over the zero discharge rule there is to put a small licence in place which a local authority can issue to the person, and will solve that problem, and that's what this bill is intended to do. Now, I'm open, of course, if people in the department have particular issues that they'd like to see resolved in that, to see amendments to it. Sensible amendments come from anywhere. None of us are geniuses in this situation. We all know, that there may be unintended consequences somewhere that we don't see, and I think we can find a way of overcoming all of those, and that's what we need to work to do.
Can I thank Deputy Kenny for his presentation here? Just make a few comments myself.
Certainly.
Coming from a rural area myself, and having dealt with one-off rural housing for the last 15 years, is one of the most frustrating processes any family can go through. And not alone having to, first of all, deal with a qualification ruling, then having to deal with location and the visual impact that your house might have on the area, then dealing with traffic regulations and the increase in traffic regulations on one-off rural houses, and now the effluent discharging that you're referring to here today. And even in my own county in Wicklow, there is some areas where there's complications, but we seem to be able to get over that by raising the bed and importing a different soil type. You did say, Deputy, that areas in Cavan, I think, with similar heavy soils, did get planning permission for one-off rural housing, but was that based on reed beds or willow beds that they got it? Or if it was a similar situation, I just wondered how can a local authority in Cavan grant permission?
Well, it is a similar situation.
Explain that.
It is a similar situation, and really, I suppose, what we're talking about here is, in Leitrim in particular, 80% of the soil would be dense. Now, if you ever go to a funeral in County Leitrim and you look into the graveyard, you'll find that when you go down to about 6 inches, you have got good soil, and when you go below that, and that's what rural people look at, look, it's just daub, it's really heavy soil. And that's what we find in a lot of County Leitrim. In West Cavan, you'd have a similar situation, but West Cavan is a lot of mountainous area, and we don't have as many planning applications, but we would have some, and it is equally as difficult to get planning in some parts of West Cavan. You would have a similar situation in some parts of Sligo as well, and in some parts of Donegal. You'd have similar situations, but in counties where you would have, I suppose, a lower percentage of the soil would be that heavy type of soil, people would have more options to find a part of the land that would have good enough absorption to be able to build a house. So they could have 40 acres, and there might be only 3 acres of it that would have that kind of soil, but that's where they'd go and build a house. So that option may not be available in a lot of parts of County Leitrim. Also in the past, going back 10-15 years before these regulations came in, a lot of planning permissions would have been granted in those areas, and they would have used willow beds and would have well used reed beds in parts of Cavan, in parts of Sligo and other counties around.
Okay. Would you have, and I'll ask maybe Leitrim Council when they make their presentation, but would you have any indication of many planning applications are refused? We have figures here of planning permissions granted. Yeah. Would you have any indication of the number of applications that are refused?
In other words, what you're really asking is how much of a backlog is there here?
Yeah, like what?
Yeah. Really, I don't know how many planning applications have been refused, but I do know how many people would actually go and meet with a planning officer and they'd say, look, I'm thinking about applying for planning, and people are encouraged always to do a pre-planning meeting. And in an awful lot of those pre-planning meetings, they're told, look, you haven't a hope here.
And they don't proceed.
And they don't even apply.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's the case, I'd say, in 90% of people who will be applying for planning. Now, there are parts of Leitrim that people still get planning where there'd be, if you like, a bit of good land in different areas around Manor Hamilton. People get planning permission in some cases, different areas around Anaduff as a parish, where if you're going down through Drummond toward Carrick and Shannon, there's a bit of reasonably good land there where an odd person would get planning permission. But it's difficult, even there. But in most of County Leitrim, it is very hard. And as I say, people actually wouldn't go and look for planning because they've been told in the pre-planning meeting they haven't a chance. That would have created a backlog. Like I'd say in my own parish at this point, if we had a situation where people could get planning, you'd probably have 8 or 10 houses that people would like to build. Probably in the whole county, you might have 40 houses. But then that would quickly go back down to probably a number of 10 or 12 a year. We're not talking about huge numbers of houses here at all. We're talking about small numbers of houses. But those small numbers of houses are not being built or having a very detrimental impact on the rural community. So part of our environment is our people. And if we starve our rural communities of people, we run into a huge problem.
Okay. And I'd like to thank Deputy Kenny for attending today and engaging with the committee. Sorry there now. I propose we suspend the meeting for a few moments to allow our witnesses to take their seats. Session. At the request of the broadcast and recording services, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting their mobile phones are turned off completely or switched to airplane, safe or flight mode depending on their device. It is not sufficient just to put phones on silent mode, as they will maintain a level of interference with the broadcasting system. Item number 7 today is detailed scrutiny of Local Government Water Pollution Amendment Bill 2018, and I would like to welcome to today's meeting Mr Joseph Gilhooly, Leitrim County Council, Dr Tom Ryan, Mr Noel Byrne and Mr Darragh Page from the Environmental Protection Agency, Mr Fergus O'Dowd and Mr David Flynn from the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government. And just a note on privilege before we begin. I wish to draw your attention to the fact by virtue of Section 17(2)(1) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of the evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that the only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise nor make charges against any person or identity by name or in such ways to make him or her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside of the House or an official either by name or in such way to make him or her identifiable. I now call on Mr Gilhooly to make his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairperson. Good morning to members of the committee. As set out, my name is Joseph Gilhooly. I'm Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Service with Leitrim County Council. I have responsibility for economic development, planning and infrastructural services with Leitrim County Council. So the background to the process here today is the Water Services Act 2007 places a duty of care on homeowners to ensure that all wastewater treatment systems are kept so as not to cause a human health problem or environment or create a nuisance through odours. For new builds, site characterisation must be carried out in accordance with the EPA Code of Practice for Wastewater Treatment and Disposal Systems serving single houses issued in 2009. In regard to this Code of Practice, particular attention is drawn to the provision that where the T-test in excess of 90, then the site is unsuitable for discharge of treated effluent to the ground. In County Leitrim, as has been set out this morning, the landscape is characterised by drumlins, which contains high clay content. Unfortunately, due to the underlying nature of the subsoils across the majority of the county, estimated 87% of the soils, the soil percolation tests failed to meet the acceptable percolation rates required to comply with the EPA Code of Practice, and the sites are deemed unsuitable for discharge of treated wastewater or effluent to the ground. This is proving a significant impediment to the granting of planning permission for individual dwellings in the countryside by Leitrim County Council as the planning authority, and indeed is preventing many prospective applicants making applications in the first instance, as agents are aware that the subject sites will be deemed unsuitable once the soil percolation tests are undertaken. The situation is not unique in County Leitrim, as has been referred to. However, no county is affected to the extent as County Leitrim. The number of planning permissions granted for individual houses relying on individual wastewater treatment systems is set out in a table that has been supplied in my statement, ranging from 4 in 2017 to 13 in 2018, and similar figures across the years since 2012, for example. Leitrim is a sparsely populated county, with the 2016 census showing a population of 32,044 persons. The county is highly rural in nature, with the vast majority of the population living in a non-urban environment. This profile of the county represents the history and culture of Leitrim, with a high proportion of small family farms. In the context of this fabric, the imposition of the percolation standards through the 2009 Code of Practice has had what the Council believes unintended consequences. These consequences are most acutely felt in the small farm holding scenario, where despite many acres of land being available, the farmer's offspring, son or daughter, who may wish to establish their home on the family farm, to continue to farm the land, or to be support to their ageing parents, will fail to secure planning permission. The compounding effect of these restrictions for 10 years now is a contributing factor to the continued depopulation of areas of rural County Leitrim, which will have the corresponding effect on the sustainability of surrounding community and its facilities and services, such as primary schools, etc. In this regard, Leitrim County Council, while maintaining a responsible attitude to the protection of the environment, as is required by law, set about identifying options that could be explored to provide a wastewater treatment solution that would be suitable, acceptable and affordable. In addition, the Council at all times maintained a responsible attitude through its county development plan in relation to rural planning, with a variety of policies that ensure the appropriate establishment of one-off rural housing in Leitrim, and would not see the restrictions of the Code of Practice as necessary or relevant from a rural planning tool control perspective. The existing EPA Code of Practice is presently under review, with a new document expected to be published in the next couple of months. It is anticipated that the review of the Code of Practice will widen slightly the acceptable parameters of percolation rates, and will result in a number of marginal sites in County Leitrim now becoming acceptable for discharge of trade effluent to ground, but as only marginal in nature, is felt that the Council must continue to pursue the alternative solutions. As referred to, Leitrim County Council has been pursuing innovative solutions to facilitate the design of wastewater treatment and disposal facility that would be suitable in the poor draining soils. Through this process, the Council identified a treatment solution that has potential to have a zero discharge or near zero discharge of effluent, and if successful would allow sites with poor percolation characteristics to treat the discharge of wastewater in a manner which would not be prejudicial to public health or the protection of the environment. The nature of the wastewater treatment system is a willow-based system constructed within a sealed soil basin. The Council is engaged with Dr Lawrence Gill, a Professor in Environmental Engineering at the School of Engineering, Trinity College, Dublin, as academic support to the process. Dr Gill has extensive experience in assessing the operation of individual wastewater treatment systems and was co-author of a PPA publication that was referred to earlier by Deputy Kenny. The Willow evapotranspiration system consists of a seal basin that has been refilled with the original soil excavated on the site in order to install an impermeable liner and distribution pipe network which has then been planted with willow cuttings. The system receives wastewater effluent feed to the base of the basin and treated and removed via the evapotranspiration, primarily during the growing season with the willow trees of high water demand, but also occurs on a limited basis all year round. Results from the trial systems to date have shown that the system provides excellent pollutant attenuation, greatly reducing organic, nutrient and indicator bacteria. Through the most recent design concepts, the level of rainfall into the system could be significantly reduced, if not eliminated, thus ensuring minimal, if any, overflow from the system. Currently, water pollution legislation provides for discharges to ground and surface waters. In regard to the domestic wastewater treatment system, there is an exemption for discharge to ground, where the quantity discharged is less than 5 metres cubed per day. However, a discharge to surface waters can only occur under licence from the local authority. As a consequence, a detailed application process is required in order to comply with the legislative requirements. The application process is lengthy and requires significant data collection on the identified receiving waters, such as all year-round flows and assimilation capacity, along with a rigorous monitoring regime thereafter in regard to items such as ongoing sampling analysis, inspection chambers, record keeping and licence renewal processes. The fact that this system of licensing discharge is more designed to deal with matters such as industrial byproducts rather than domestic wastewater treatment systems. A pilot scheme is currently proposed in Leitrim to further test the Willow system for zero discharge. That is, that there is no discharge or escape of effluent from the willow plantation basin at any time, based on a more refined design taking learning from the trials to date. However, on the trials to date, the objective zero discharge for the system has not been fully realised. In addition to that detail earlier in regard to attenuation, what is known is that the willow system does deliver significantly reduced level of effluent discharge, with discharge only in the winter months. So, taking into account the research already available, what is now required is a means disposed of limited resulting discharge proven to be primarily arising from rainfall, if any. The option for this discharge to proceed to surface water, to surface discharge only, given the ground conditions on the subject site preventing discharge to ground. Given the proved reduced scale of effluent, its proven standard, and the fact that discharge arises during the wetter times of the year, then there is a case for the development, in the context of the output from these systems, of a less rigorous regulatory regime that is both appropriate and proportionate, and which would therefore move away from the rigours of the current authorisation process for discharge to surface waters. This reformed regulatory process can be limited to provide only for installations meeting certain design standards based on the experience of the Willow systems to date, for example. The data also available provides the basis for both design guidelines for the system and design parameters for the discharge, particularly in relation to volume, effluent standard and items such as that. Through the work carried out nationally to date, along with the work of Leitrim County Council, there is now an immediate opportunity to address the unintended consequences of the provisions of the Code of Practice of 2009 in relation to sites of low permeability. This opportunity is in regard to the use of the domestic wastewater evapotranspiration treatment system, coupled with the requested regulatory reform under the Water Pollution Act 1997. This will provide, in instance, a clear option for the provision of renewal rural dwelling where the housing need to be accommodated in rural Leitrim is of absolute requirement, which in turn could be of general application in areas of the country with similar soil conditions. The pilot system in Leitrim will continue to pursue the objective of zero discharge, which would be the ultimate preferred outcome.
Thank you. Tom, would you like to make your presentation?
Thank you, Chair. And first of all, I'd like to thank the committee for inviting the Environmental Protection Agency to assist in the detailed scrutiny of the amendment bill. I'm joined by my colleagues from EPA's Office of Environmental Enforcement, Darragh Page and Noel Byrne. As the committee will be aware, the EPA is an independent statutory body established under the Environmental Protection Act 1992, and our organisational vision is to protect and improve the environment as a valuable asset for the people of Ireland, and also to protect our people from, and the environment from the harmful effects of radiation and pollution. To that end, the EPA performs a number of functions that are particularly pertinent to the current discussions, including monitoring the quality of the Irish environment and in particular the quality of our water courses. We are responsible for the development of the National Inspection Plan for domestic wastewater treatment systems and the coordination and reporting on the implementation of that national plan. And also we develop and maintain a code of practice on wastewater treatment and disposal systems serving single houses, as has been mentioned by previous speakers. With regard to water quality in Ireland, I'd like to highlight a number of troubling findings in recent EPA reports that I think are relevant to our discussions. Water quality in Irish waters has deteriorated with a net overall decline of 3% in good water quality between 2015 and 2017. Long-term loss of high-quality river sites is continuing, with a further 0.6% decline since 2015. And the EPA Groundwater National Monitoring Programme found that 43% of groundwater monitoring wells were contaminated with fecal coliform in 2017. These findings illustrate the vulnerability of our groundwaters, which provide much of our drinking water in rural Ireland, as well as the vulnerability of our surface waters, where we are failing to arrest the continued decline in quality. These are priorities. These priorities are shared challenges, both in terms of human health protection and environmental protection. The Water Services Act 2007, as amended, and the associated regulations, among other things, provide for inspections of domestic wastewater treatment systems by water service authorities. The EPA is responsible for preparing the National Inspection Plan, which specifies the minimum number of inspections across the country for each local authority area. Inspections are targeted to those areas where there is the greatest potential for improving water quality and improving the protection of human health. The EPA reports regularly on the implementation of the plan, and the report for 2017 to 2018 period, due for publication shortly, will show that almost half of the domestic wastewater treatment systems inspected in the reporting period failed the inspection. And that's consistent with previous years and showing persistent problems with these existing systems. Failures are due to system construction defects and systems not being maintained and cleaned properly. Over 1/4 of systems are found to be causing a risk to the environment or human health, and almost 1/3 of systems that failed between the 2013 to 2018 period are still not fixed, with many of those unresolved for more than 1 year. Domestic wastewater treatment systems are a risk to human health and the environment if they are not constructed and maintained properly. They can contribute to a householder's drinking water well, or to the contamination of a householder's drinking water well or their neighbour's well. And in this context, it should be noted that Ireland has the highest rate of VTEC infection in the EU, with over 1,100 cases in 2018. And one possible source of this infection is contaminated drinking water from private wells. The EPA published the current Code of Practice for Wastewater Treatment and Disposal Systems serving single houses in 2009, and the code is referenced throughout the Building Regulations Technical Guidance Document H on drainage and wastewater disposal. The purpose of the code is to ensure that domestic wastewater treatment systems are constructed and maintained properly so they do not contaminate groundwater and surface waters and endanger people's health. Essentially, the code sets out how to determine if a site is suitable for the installation of a treatment system and the standards necessary for the construction and maintenance of the system, providing several construction options depending on the site constraints and householder requirements. Now, the current code was published over a decade ago, and EPA is cognizant of the importance of ensuring that national guidelines reflect available and emerging technologies and practices and techniques. To that end, research funded by the EPA, mentioned already, was recently conducted through a collaboration between researchers at Trinity College Dublin, NUI Galway and NUI Maynooth to examine further domestic wastewater treatment options in areas of low permeability soils. This research identified 2 new technologies, low pressure pipe and drip dispersal systems, which can operate in low permeability soils, increasing the percolation limits and hence providing greater flexibility for householders and planners. These new technologies and the associated increase in the percolation limits are incorporated in the draft revised code, which was published in December 2018 for 3 months consultation. During the consultation period, 36 submissions were received containing almost 500 individual comments on the code. And the code revision process is being overseen by a steering committee which is currently considering the submissions with a view to finalising the revised code by the end of the year. And the steering committee is comprised of representatives of the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government, local authorities, as well as industry and the research community. The Code of Practice represents the best available technical and scientific knowledge for domestic wastewater treatment systems. For homeowners, it provides the assurance of having their site assessed to a proper standard and that the system chosen will operate satisfactorily in the long term, protecting their health, the health of their neighbours and the environment. And finally, Chair, I'd like to assure the committee that the EPA will continue to work closely with local authorities and government departments and others to assist in the assessment of possible solutions and strategies in this area and to support further research where that's identified, with the primary objective of ensuring the protection of people's health and the environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Fergus.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for the invitation to attend committee today as part of the detailed scrutiny of the Local Government Water Pollution Amendment Bill 2018. I'm joined by my colleague David Flynn, Principal Advisor. Just by way of preliminary comment, the Department understands and appreciates the intent behind the private member's bill, that is to make possible and facilitate the choice of those who wish to live in rural communities outside cities, towns and villages. In the context of that rationale behind the bill, Minister Damien English last week organised a meeting with Deputy Kenny and a delegation of public representatives and officials from Leitrim County Council to discuss the particular challenges of providing domestic wastewater treatment systems in Leitrim. As we've heard this morning, Leitrim County Council, with the support of the EPA, has been working with Trinity College to investigate treatment systems using willow beds. The Department agreed at that meeting last week to follow up with a more detailed technical engagement with the County Council and EPA to explore how a pilot project could be supported. The Department also noted, Chair, that there was unanimity at the meeting that any solutions which may be developed should not give rise to a threat to human health and the environment. That is in line with the current general statutory requirements not to allow the deterioration of the chemical or ecological status of water bodies such as rivers, lakes, estuaries, coastal waters and groundwater. The imperative to maintain good water quality is the right thing to do in any event to manage risk and for the protection of human health. The private member's bill seeks to make it easier to issue a discharge licence under the Water Pollution Acts in cases where the EPA approved domestic wastewater treatment systems would not be adequate. However, as set out in the Department's letter to the committee, The Department is concerned that the bill does not contain adequate safeguards to ensure that Irish law is compliant with the EU Water Framework Directive, or would not give rise to potential significant threat to the environment and public health. Ireland, as we know, has a very high dependence on individual wastewater treatment systems, and we have already been found guilty in the Court of Justice of the European Union for failure to put in place adequate safeguards in relation to the environmental performance of these systems. And again, the inspection regime and the current grant regimes that the Department have put in place are in response to that judgment. In 2012, the Court found that Ireland had failed to take the necessary measures to ensure that waste is recovered or disposed of without endangering human health and without processes or methods which could harm the environment. The judgment led to financial penalties of €2.76 million and had implications for the 440,000 wastewater treatment systems serving single houses. As a result, the Water Services Amendment Act 2012 introduced legislation and inspection arrangements for domestic wastewater treatment systems. I highlight this because the private member's bill before us seeks to amend the provisions of Section 4 of the Local Government Water Pollution Act 1977 to provide for the granting of discharge licences to surface waters to allow for the development of single houses. We have some experience, primarily in County Wexford, where the local authority used discharge licences to facilitate house construction during the 2000s. The difficulties encountered by householders in managing licensed discharge to surface waters included the technical challenges of managing the wastewater treatment system and achieving the required effluent standard. Where difficulties were encountered, such as the malfunctioning of the domestic wastewater treatment system, causing pollution to receiving waters, significant local issues arose in relation to public health concerns, the use of water for livestock drinking, and problems with foul odours. The majority of these licences have had to be revoked at considerable cost to householders. Since 2009, Wexford County Council has worked in collaboration with householders to find sustainable solutions to minimise the impact of these legacy systems. In many cases, householders requested licences to be terminated because of the difficulties they have encountered in managing the systems. In these cases, alternative solutions not involving direct discharges to receiving waters have been developed in consultation with Wexford County Council. In most cases, the alternative solutions place a significant additional financial burden on householders. It is also important to note, again as we heard from the EPA, that there are reliable and sustainable technological solutions available to those building new houses under the current regulatory framework for domestic wastewater treatment systems. In addition to septic tanks, the feasibility of alternative treatment systems for low permeability soils, such as low pressure pipes and drip dispersal systems, have been researched. Again, in the context of the new guidelines which the EPA are developing, such alternatives may be permissible for some areas that have previously failed percolation tests and are unable to support percolation areas. From an environmental perspective, the proposal in the bill as drafted would pose a significant risk to water quality in receiving waters, lakes and estuarine waters in rural areas. In particular, this is because discharges of septic tank type effluents directly to surface water generally pose a higher risk to water quality than discharging to groundwater via a septic tank's percolation area. The percolation area which domestic treatment systems use is a vital component in treating and reducing pollutant load of the wastewater effluent. Making it easier to licence less safe effluent discharge options is likely to pose unacceptable risks. In summary, the effluent discharging to surface waters from domestic scale wastewater treatment systems poses a significant risk to water quality in receiving waters. The consequence is likely to be degraded water quality in receiving water, which would be contrary to our legal obligations, with all the attendant increased risk to human health. In particular, Section 413A of the proposed bill appears to suggest that the local authority must issue a licence under Section 4 of the Local Government Water Pollution Act 1977, regardless of whether the discharge would cause deterioration in water quality and would be contrary to any existing water policy and associated water quality standards and objectives. And I heard Deputy Kenny's comment in relation to whether that's a must or not, but the Department considers that it does open an unacceptable risk. This would leave a local authority exposed to risk of legal action for breaching its duty under a number of pieces of legislation intended to protect human health and the environment. For all the foregoing reasons, the Department has significant concerns with the private member's bill, but we will be happy to explore these issues in more detail with the committee. And just to finally say, I think from the conversations from the meeting last week, from the positive attitude adopted from Leitrim County Council, the new guidelines being developed by the EPA, I think there are opportunities to come at this issue and the particular challenges facing County Leitrim in a different way that could help the situation without the need for the blunt instrument of legislation, which could cause more problems than it solves. Thank you, Chair.
Owen.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks to the three presenters. I suppose the first thing to say is this committee takes its responsibilities very seriously in terms of issues related to water quality, and Tom or Fergus will know we've spent quite a bit of time ensuring that the very important reports that the EPA publishes annually, looking at, for example, wastewater treatment and the risks arising from plants, but also on the private side, are an issue that we scrutinise regularly. And I think when we're looking at this piece of legislation, we're looking at it through not just the lens of trying to facilitate people to live in the communities from which they're born, but also that we maintain that kind of focus on maintaining our high quality water systems. Certainly that's my own focus. I suppose the challenge for us is to try and find a way of ensuring that where in all other instances a planning applicant would otherwise get planning permission but for this issue, is there a way of solving this problem that doesn't in any way compromise the quality of our water system? And I think that's the challenge that Martin has set himself and we're discussing here today. So I have three questions, one for each of the presenters, which really kind of focus around that key challenge, because I think if we can fix that, then we have a solution that meets the kind of the interest of everybody here, both in terms of the attendees and the members. So, I suppose, Tom, the first question to you is Martin made the case that it is possible to have a zero effect, even if you don't have a zero discharge. I'm interested to hear the EPA's view on that. To what extent is that possible? To what extent does the kind of natural technologies such as reed beds and willow beds that Martin outlined and Joseph outlined allow you to move towards that? And if we're not 100% there yet, do you have a view in terms of how long it might take for those kinds of systems to achieve that? Fergal, I hear what you're saying, but Section 4, 13B empowers the Minister to make regulations for the purposes of the granting of these licences. So rather than saying that this is a blunt instrument of a piece of legislation, in fact, even if this piece of legislation were to pass, the ball then falls in your court as the lead person to advise the Minister in terms of how to draft those regulations. And I'd never accuse you of being blunt in your work with the Department, so I'm sure you'd be able to find a way of crafting those regulations to meet both our legal obligations, but also to protect water sources. So I just want you to kind of maybe respond to that particular bit. Surely regulations give you that level of control and nuance that would be required for something important like this. And then Joseph, Fergal mentioned new technologies that are coming on stream that should allow in dense soil areas the possibility of this problem being overcome. In terms of the technologies he referenced and he referenced too, from your understanding, would they be much use in County Leitrim, where you have such a large section of the county that currently is failing the percolation tests? And maybe if you can tell us a little bit more about some of the other work that you've been doing in terms of developing technologies that would meet the planning requirements and the water quality requirements as well.
Start with Tom, will I see as we...
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Deputy, for the question. I suppose if we just look at the current technologies for treating domestic wastewater, and even those that are signified in or incorporated into the revised code that we've just been consulting on, that allow greater flexibility in areas of low permeability soil. The issue is that once you go above a certain soil permeability level where soil is compacted, there's nowhere for the discharging effluent water to go. So it ponds, you have dangerous pathogens and E. coli accumulating on the property that give rise to significant health risks to the people in the dwelling, to the children, to the neighbours, and to well waters. And that's the difficulty in these low permeability soils. So the code extends the flexibility there because of the new technology, so we can push the limit somewhat, and as has been signalled, that may allow some permissions to be granted in the right circumstances. Planners will consider that. But looking to the future, yes, the willowbed evapotranspiration systems are promising, and we've been happy to support that research, and I think there's more work to be done there. And for certain elements of the discharge, they are quite effective, but it's not a zero it doesn't allow for zero discharge. That means that there is some liquids, but more importantly, it also means that this system is not quite effective at taking out the more hazardous pathogens, or E. coli in particular effectively. So it's not a case that there's no impact. There could be a significant impact with the accumulation of residual waters with E. coli. Now, I say it looks promising because it is effective at taking out some of the other elements, but this is the stumbling block, but worthy of pursuing further research on. And the time frame for that kind of research, not really sure. It could take a couple of seasons to establish, but I know that there are ideas being contemplated as to how these systems might be more effective. So it's an area very well worth pursuing, and the EPA would be very happy to support that kind of work.
Fergus.
Yeah, thank you, Deputy. I think you put your finger on the nub of the bill. There's a very general opening provision to say nothing, notwithstanding anything else in the law, nothing shall prevent a local authority issuing a licence. So that's opening the door very wide and a danger. And then it's pulled back by, okay, this is controlled by regulation. So you could work with the bill, but as people are probably very much aware now in terms of the approach to legislation these days following Supreme Court judgments, is legislation must set out policies and principles. So we'd need to do a lot of work on the bill to set out the policies and principles around which the Ministry of Regulations. We're no longer allowed to legislate saying the Minister can just go away and make regs on anything. That's been found out. We need to be clear in the piece of legislation regarding what are the regulations going to cover, what's the framework within which the regulations operate. That will then bring you to a piece of a very simple premise that the regulations must ensure that people's health and the environment is protected. So that would be the context in which regulations are developed. Then the regulation would then bring us to a point where the Minister would probably task the EPA with developing the relevant standards to ensure that any discharges do not impact on health and the environment, which will bring us back to where we are now, which is codes of practice and regulatory regimes which are designed to ensure that the health and the environment is not impacted. So I suspect we could do a huge amount of work, spend a huge amount of time on legislating, but actually wouldn't really bring us any further to what the current legal position is. What we suggested when we met last week was to have greater technical discussions between the County Council, ourselves and the EPA, see where they bring us. If those discussions say, well, actually there are legislative tweaks or regulatory tweaks that are required, that could inform how we'd approach it in the future. It could be tweaks that within the existing code without the need for new legislation. And indeed, as we see, even within the current regime, as Tom outlined, the EPA are already, through the new guidelines which are being developed, allowing for new technologies which will give greater scope. So that's a little bit of a convoluted answer to say that by the time we went through a significant legislative process, we may not actually bring the issue a huge amount further. Whereas if we work closely together with the EPA and ourselves and the County Council through guidelines, we actually may help resolve issues in some of these areas.
Joe?
Chairperson, yeah, I'd be familiar with the amendments in the draft code of practice that was published and that has been referred to earlier in relation to the piece of technology around the drip dispersal system and the low pressure piping system. And I suppose you have to take into account that we have a very acute problem in Leitrim with the soils, and you don't have much, borderline cases. You either are okay or you're far from it okay. And allowing for the new systems that's been suggested in the draft code, if it becomes approved, and the changes in the level of the T-test that would arise because those systems would allow a higher T-test to be acceptable. We would be of the view that that would have a very limited positive impact on the county because of the soil types we find ourselves in. So whether you're at a T-test of 90 or 120 or 130 or 110 doesn't really matter. And the new technologies are those that can handle the system to allow for your higher level of T-test. So while it is, and certainly, and as was alluded to earlier, there is, situations where you are successful and the data shows that we are granting one-off houses in a very limited number of areas, and every change, so we will welcome any positive adjustment to the code of practice. So it's not that we're negative towards it, we'd be welcoming it and delighted to see it coming. But we would have to say that it wouldn't be a solution to the degree of the need that exists in Leitrim. In relation to the work that we've been doing and where we're at the moment and going forward, I think sort of the second half to the question. We have been, I'd be fairly familiar with the space insofar as that I was assigned to the Planning Department as Director in 2010, September 2010, and it was the first thing that was on your desk when you arrived. That took a period of time of learning and coming up to speed with what was happening and what options may or may not be there and what options certainly wouldn't be there, and we walked our way through that both from an official perspective and a political perspective to get to a point in 2012-2013 we started to look at piloting various options or looking at what was out there that may work, and then you would have to pilot them in the context of Leitrim and Ireland if you're looking internationally. And that work has been ongoing, and we have accumulated a certain level of knowledge and understanding. And I would have to say I've been with this process since then, that I think that we're on the cusp of making some progress. I'd be very much encouraged by the meeting that we had recently, very encouraged by my colleagues here from the department and the EPA, who have both emphasised the willingness to work closely to assist in strategising on how these options could be deployed, and looking at how we could work collaboratively is very important to us. For a good while we had been working a little bit in isolation insofar as that, and I don't mean that really negatively, but we would have a sense that we would go ahead, we would do some work, we would pilot something, we would get research, and when we would have all our papers together, then we would be arriving at the department's door and at the EPA door saying, well, we have all this done now, can we try and find some way to implement this on a more general application basis. I think that we very much could have the opportunity here to be cutting out that stage, so that we'll be moving forward collaboratively and collectively from next week when we intend to meet on this, so that we wouldn't be at a point where we're on a two-pronged approach here, where we set about establishing something, we think it works, we'd have done a certain level of research, we'd have our reports there, and then find that we have to start to get into a bit of a sales mode to get the success of the information and the research we've done across to others. If we're doing that together, we can take out a lot of time out of the system. We're very encouraged by the learning that has come and the work that we've been doing with the Trinity College people in what the next phase of the pilot would look like in relation to willows. We're at this stage probably 100% focused on the willow evapotranspiration system as being the solution worth pursuing. We'd be encouraged that by the research that's already there about looking at how could you strip out more of the rainwater impact, the rainfall impact on the system, that could be achievable. Now, the impact on that, on the efficiency of the system, has to be tested, but that's why we need to pilot it. But that if we're able to strip out, and I know the calculations previous in some of the reports that were alluded to earlier was mentioning something like reduction of, I think, 60% of the rainfall hitting the system, that could make the difference of being a zero discharge or not. And we think that that's an achievable figure, provided that the revised design process is still efficient and dealing with the system properly in the reform design. So we'd be very encouraged and looking forward to proceeding on the lines that have been set out collectively and collaboratively with the EPA and the department.
Okay, Deputy Kenny.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Just first of all, to Tom, in regard to the EPA, you say that you're very encouraged that the ET system does a very good job in general, but you have issues around E. coli in particular and how that can be dealt with. Is there possibilities there? Because I know a lot of systems that have been in the past have a polishing element at the end of them, which is about eliminating the E. coli aspect of it. Do you think, is there a possibility there to look at that as an addition at the end of the ET system, that there could be a polishing system put onto that in order to do that? Or do you believe that a further refinement and further research into the ET system on its own may be able to achieve that reduction to the levels that's negligible and won't have any impact or have a zero effect? Also, in regard to Fergus, you mentioned about when the door is open and fully, and then it's pulled back a bit, that the minister may regulate it. Like, that's pretty much exactly what the intention is. That the minister would set out regulations which would be very strict and would ensure that the impact on the environment would be eliminated. But the difficulty we have is the zero discharge element of it. And even if we come to a stage where we do, with collaboration and with the good work that's been done by Leitrim County Council and the EPA and all of the others, and we come to a situation where we say, look, the discharge we have here is, first of all, extremely small, it has been reduced considerably, and is of a very, very high standard, which will have a zero impact on the future. We still come back to the problem that we have a discharge. And you're saying that there may be another way, other than putting a licence in place, to deal with that discharge. Can you try and explain to me where you feel that other way may arise, or if that other way is possible? Also, Joseph mentioned about the soil types in Leitrim we have are such a large quantity of it is impermeable, and we very seldom have a whole lot of areas there which are borderline. So, the moving from a T90 to a T120 in the vast majority of cases will make no difference. That's just the reality, because it's not that we have a whole series of borderline cases. We have very, very few borderline cases. So I wonder, in the context of that, and just to come back to Joseph, if we have a situation where we're going to try and achieve as close to zero discharge as possible, with zero impact, how long will it take to finish that research, do you think? Like, I think Tom mentioned perhaps a couple of seasons. Considering the volume of work that has already been done, could we come to this quickly? Because, I'm very conscious of the, I suppose, the sense of panic, the sense of real frustration that there exists in Leitrim and in many rural communities, which they just feel that they're being shut down and nobody cares about them, and that we really need to deal with this. Like, to be honest with you, I feel very frustrated that we're 10 years coming looking for solutions, and people out there are saying, it's a sort of shame on all your houses that you couldn't come up with a solution to this sooner. And I think we really need to put a really intense focus on this to get this solution in place as quickly as possible. And perhaps, Joseph, you could outline what you feel may be an appropriate time frame to come to a solution here. And really what I feel is that we need, if we come to the solution that we have the technology right and we feel that can work, but we also want to make sure that legislatively or regulatory, that we also have that in place in advance, so that as soon as we reach that, people can move on it. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, Tom, start with yourself.
Thank you very much, Deputy, again for the question. And just say from the outset that we empathise with the challenges that are facing people and planners and regulators in the area, in the context of poor soil percolation and the social issues around that. It's a very, very challenging environment to work in. I suppose the key thing from our developing of the code of practice is around protecting the people that live there in their homes, to make sure that the systems that they have in place are not injurious to their health and to their neighbours' health and their children's health. The specific question around will the willow evapotranspiration system working in some combination with existing systems provide zero impact? The current research says they're very good, they're getting there, but they're not there yet. So being very positive about it, it does look promising, and it is worthy of support, and the EPA is there to work with colleagues to support that.
In the actual report that has already been produced, the conclusion stated that the system actually, it says in it, however, chemical and microbiological sampling of the water in the sumps and ponded water over the winter period showed an improved water quality equivalent to surface water runoff from other systems that had not been fed any effluent. So it states that the runoff was actually equal to areas where no effluent went into, which is that suggesting that there's already E. coli in the groundwater out there without any effluent arrival to it, and that you're comparing with, in other words, you're comparing dirty water with dirty water rather than actually. Do you get where I'm coming from? That you're trying to achieve something which isn't actually achievable in that sense, or is that an incorrect conclusion to draw from that?
No, I mean, I had the report here in front of me on the research that was done, and I said these systems are performing very well for some of the constituents of the receiving effluent. And a part of the study that was done was looking at, where you put in effluent into the system and where you put in it's not raw effluent into the system, and compare them. And it does work very well, but not for E. coli. And this is the real problem. They're not yet at the level of efficiency for taking out E. coli. It is getting there. It may be that it's not, a combination of polishing, that it may be something to do with the design, protecting the system from the ingress of rainwater. So they're the kind of issues that future research would look at. But yes, I mean, they're doing very well. They're doing well on some of the nutrients, but on the key one, E. coli, not so well. And if you put in a system like that, you will have residual E. coli ponding and building in the locality and causing all of the attendant health risks.
Chairman, in relation to possibly regulatory change, I suppose it's important to go back to the 77 Act, and I'm even reluctant to go back to an act that far in the area of the environment, but it does provide the Section 4 licence, and then under Section 6 it goes into more detail about what the Minister can require under regulations, the form of the licence, information to be specified, evidence that must be provided, and so on. So the regulations set out that kind of heavy regime that you're talking about. So there are always ways to adjust regulations within the existing statute, but we would suggest that we work through a process of the revised EPA guidelines, the process of dialogue that we now set up with Leitrim County Council, come to conclusions, and then say, well, actually, there is a rationale for adjusting the regulatory regime under the existing Act. There's a bit of a process around that. Like, for example, in relation to supporting ongoing pilots, which the department would be happy to work with EPA and Leitrim on, if we can put a credible project together. You would still need that heavy, for a pilot phase, you would need that heavy information gathering, monitoring, in any case, so that the pilot can prove itself. And that then would inform us in saying, well, actually, this system works well. Under the existing Act, you could have a lighter form of licence, but we need the evidence first to support that. But look, we're happy to engage to see where that might bring us.
Would it be a statutory instrument that would bring us to that, which is much faster to move than a...
Well, regulation is a regulation is a statutory instrument. Yeah.
Okay.
So there are easier.
And you feel that's possible to do within the confines that are there?
Within the existing Act, but we would still need an evidential base to bring us to that point. But look, we're happy to work with all parties to see where that might bring us.
Okay.
Joe, have you anything?
If I pick up the point in relation to timescale, it's difficult to put your finger on that, I suppose, Deputy, insofar as that. What we'd be hoping is that we can bring a fair volume of learning from the existing trials forward. Then we have to look at trialling the systems that have reformed design based on what we're trying to achieve, or the remaining elements that needs to be addressed, and how the system can work most effectively. To trial a system, that's going to take time. It's fairly clear. At the moment, there's no authorised development out there in Leitrim to proceed with the trial. So you're dependent on design, you're dependent on getting a process through the planning process, approval, construction. The system is a natural system, so it has to be constructed, established. Then that takes a period of time to happen. Now, that can run in conjunction with the construction of the property. So your system is ideally ready to receive effluent when the house is ready for occupation. And from then on, then you're starting to move into your monitoring stage. I think when we'll be working collectively, this will be a process of engagement that will be ongoing. When you would take the information that would be available from the trials and the reports and the analysis that's there, I would like to think that after the system is established, it's receiving effluent and gets a chance to mature, that early analysis could be quite informative to know if you actually are starting to turn the corner on things like the escape of effluent, what is the composition of the effluent, have we succeeded in separating the rainfall been repelled from the system, let's say, rather than it seemed to be absorbed into the system and been discharged out of the system. So have we been able to achieve the fact that the rainfall has been successfully dealt with, that the system is still performing as well as the previous systems had, notwithstanding that it's a new design and more of a cover, that you're clearly showing what's within the system is pure effluent, and that you're either at a point of a zero discharge of effluent then, or what is leaving the system. You're able to measure the parameters, and as the design changes, allowed for dealing with some of the issues. For example, the E. coli, and that's the path we're on. So it's not going to be short. There's no magic formula, but you would like to think that this year could see a lot of the groundwork done through the meetings that we expect to have, and having sites then that maybe at an approval level that they were good to go for the spring of next year. And then you're probably into, you're looking at 2 years from then. That would be, I think, probably early, and probably causing concern maybe to some people here to think that within a year of the system being functioning, that you would have research you could depend on. But I think that you would certainly be able to start to be sure and identify the steps that were taken in that design are actually having a meaningful impact, if that should be the case. So that you would develop competence very quick to show that the outcome after the first year of occupation was moving in the right direction and addressing any of the remaining issues. I think it's important that as we go along, it's important that there's a number of stakeholders outside of the room as well. You know, you have individual people who are looking at the future of their life in Leitrim or other counties with this problem, but there's also other stakeholders who are worried about the environment, and I think it's important that the steps will be taken, that we are in a position to be able to assure people as we go along of the quality assure each step as we go along, so that we're not raising any false expectations or trying to set out to achieve the best we can, that we are generating concern or other issues within the overall big picture.
You want to come back in there?
Yeah, look, again, thank you very much for the answers, and they're all, I suppose, all of the information is information that we have to take very seriously. I mean, Fergal, I suppose I hear what you're saying, particularly in terms of promoting public health and meeting our EU obligations. I'm not convinced it would take, in terms of this piece of legislation, a very complicated piece of drafting to ensure that whatever licensing regime was in place would have to be compliant with both of those things. And Martin is a very reasonable guy. I'm sure a friendly amendment to work those two things in would address some of your concerns. Ultimately, of course, it's still a statutory instrument, it's still regulations. That's still going to have to be based on the evidence that everybody's outlined. And what we have learned in the last 2 years is even imperfectly drafted pieces of legislation from the opposition can put a little bit of extra pressure on government and then on the department to do something that probably wouldn't have happened in that timescale if we hadn't been doing what we're doing. The student accommodation is a very obvious one. The microbeads legislation that we're having in second stage later on today is another. So I suppose, given that Joseph is talking about being on the cusp of something, I'd be certainly of a mind to think about taking on board what you're saying, but by way of sensible amendments to this, to keep the pressure on you guys so that the very positive things that we're hearing from everybody continue to be very positive, because I do detect a little bit of frustration in Joseph's very diplomatically described 10 years or 9 years of working on this particular issue. So if we're now in a really good space, I think that's a really positive thing, but I'd say Martin would be of a mind, and I'd support him to apply some very helpful pressure on you guys, and I'd be urging members to kind of work with us in the committee to think, you know, rather than dismissing the expertise of the department, working some of that in at committee stage through sensible amendments to keep the process moving forward. Thanks, Chair.
I'll just have a few remarks to make as well, and I think Owen has said it in his statement, and indeed Deputy Kenny said it, that no, it's not the intention of his bill or the intention of the committee here to put any public health at risk. And equally, I don't think it's any rural one-off individual wants to contaminate their neighbour's well drinking water either. But at the end of the day, we're looking at families who are trying to build a home on their own land in indeed a time of a housing crisis, I suppose. And I've been dealing, as I said in my introduction, with one-off road housing for 15 years now. It has consumed most of my time. And sometimes rural people get the feeling, and I get the feeling of that one-off rural housing is just looked on as a negative, all the way from Europe, all the way to national level, all the way down to local level, that we actually do not want one-off rural housing. And that's the basis that an applicant is starting from, and of to try and convert a number of negatives to positives to try and get that home for what they believe is their family. And maybe to just put a few things into context, and one, Fergal, going to yourself, you do say that I think we got financial penalties of 2.76 million for in around 440 wastewater treatment facilities, one-off facilities. Like, what other fines are we as a state getting for our public wastewater facilities that's discharged? And if we were to compare like with like, which is the lesser of the two evils? I often wonder, because there's a huge, significant lack of investment in public wastewater infrastructure, and indeed we're being fined significantly on that point. Just to try and put it into perspective, that it's not just rural housing that's polluting our rivers and our streams. Indeed, it's our public wastewater treatment plants are doing the same as well. Just to put things into context, you did mention Wexford in relation to private housing developments, and I can fully concur with you that I think we've one or two in Wicklow. that has continued to cause problems where there was discharge licence given and there was huge issues over ongoing maintenance of wastewater facilities. And Tom, just in relation to your own point, in relation to the water quality, I think you said it's been a decrease of 3%. That wouldn't be all just related to septic tanks, or there's other factors at play there, including maybe agriculture, and even my own constituency, former mining activity has had a huge bearing on the water quality. Just to try and put things into perspective, that water quality, when you say it has diminished by 3%, it's not just because of one-off rural housing. There's a significant other things at play there, including the public supply or public discharge. And then, Joseph, just in relation to just a few points, you do say in relation to consideration of a replacement house, there is a provision in the existing code of practice amounting to a relaxation of standards where an existing wastewater treatment system exists. Now, assume you're talking to somebody who has a house and is replacing that house. Even though that replacement house can increase the population, the same standards don't apply to that development. And further moving on from that, I'm not too sure exactly the breakdown of Leitrim in relation to the sizes of villages. In relation to villages in Leitrim, how many of them will be on public mains supply and sewerage, both water and storage? And what level of investment are Irish Water making into our small rural villages in Leitrim in relation to improving the capacity of our villages to cater for rural housing? Because I actually think this is a problem nationally, where Irish Water are not investing in any infrastructure into our rural villages in any shape, form or manner, unless they're polluting and they have no choice but to go in. There's just a few questions maybe to the... So I'll start off. Yeah. Start with Fergus.
Chairman, you mentioned that maybe the one-off housing issue generally. Obviously, I'm representing the Water Division here, but I can say in relation to the department, the department has always facilitated, or the policy has facilitated one-off housing. There are significant differences from Wicklow with pressure from the Dublin metropolitan area and areas like Leitrim, and the planning policy has always recognised that and has been supportive of housing, particularly in areas where there is deep population. You mentioned urban wastewater treatment, and you're absolutely correct. Sometimes there's a tendency to say, well, don't blame us because there's another problem over there. We have no option but to tackle all the issues in this regard, whether it's urban wastewater treatment, the wider agricultural sector, forestry, or individual septic tanks. And the EPA's reports will point to all those pressures, and we have no choice but to put them on. And in fact, we were found guilty in the Court of Justice of the European Union only last March, only 2 months ago, for failures in relation to urban wastewater treatment. And myself and David met the Commission on Tuesday this week in relation to that case, where they specifically raised the issue of the Arklow wastewater treatment plant, for example. And that's true. They actually pointed to it because it's been such a saga. So we can't avoid any of these issues. So look, I think that's it. David, was there any other point?
Yeah, no, I think that's
yeah. So, yeah, I think that's the general.
Yeah, no, just sorry.
No, I suppose, no, in fairness, and you mentioned the investment, we do have, because under the National Development Plan and the Irish Water, we have a very strong programme of investment, and we have a timetable for all the schemes that were cited in the court judgment.
Were the Commission satisfied when you told them that, is the question?
Yeah, no, what they will want is regular reporting and make sure that we keep to our word, that they will keep us under tight scrutiny. And if we don't deliver the programme as promised, then they do have the option to go back to court for fines. Yeah, that's absolutely true.
Thank you, Chair. No, I certainly didn't want to give the impression that single dwellings and their septic tanks are the sole pressure on our water quality. Water quality is a complex area, and there are lots of pressures bearing on quality. And I suppose I thought it was important to set out the overall context, and there is a decline there. But septic tanks are part of the pressure, and we have a river basin management plan, and it states that domestic wastewater, including septic tank systems, associated one-off housing, and unlicensed private urban wastewater treatment plants, they're small conurbations, is a significant pressure in about 11% of water bodies that are identified as at risk in the management plan. So it's not an insignificant pressure, it is there, and it's one of those things that we have to manage.
Joe?
In regard to the replacement house, the Code of Practice, quite rightly makes a provision to allow for upgrading or improvement of existing sites. And I suppose that comes from the point that if somebody is developing on an existing site that has the benefit of an existing wastewater treatment system, what can only be expected on that site is to use best available technology and get the maximum you can get to protect human health and the environment as part of that upgrade. But you have to bear in mind that people in existing property or inheriting or buying a property with an existing wastewater treatment system have an approved authorised development that they can occupy. They may become part of the National Inspection Plan, as was alluded to earlier, and that can arise depending on the risk analysis and what inspections are carried out on the annual basis in any local authority area. But you are coming from the basis of that property is already an authorised property with an authorised use, and people can reoccupy that and operate the system that's there. So it's by far preferable to see the system improved and a better standard system installed as part of any development, and that would be the requirement. But it gives that derogation from what it just means is that you don't have to establish that you can achieve your T90 if you're moving into a site with an existing system. The priority there is to improve the system to the best available technology and standards that you can achieve. In relation to the town and villages, Leitrim is relatively fortunate insofar as that most of the reasonable sized settlements have public sewage systems, wastewater treatment systems. I would think that, and I don't have the figure exactly, but you'd be up, maybe 18 villages. We count the county having about 27 towns and villages. I would imagine that there's 20, if not more, of those are served by a public wastewater treatment system. In relation to current investment, it's right that Irish Water, currently from a Leitrim context, and I presume it's repeated nationally in a lot of cases, the priority is about, and as mentioned in relation to the areas at risk and under pressure as identified by the river basin management plans, Irish Water currently priority is to improve and deal with deficiencies in any existing systems, and there is investment in that regard in Leitrim, both in water and in wastewater, but not from the point of view of extending capacity of any existing system in County Leitrim anywhere.
Just a quick follow-up on the technical point of the willows. I think from what I can gather, it's really the rainwater or surface water that's causing the major problem in achieving the levels. What depth does this dense soil go to? How deep is it? Like, is it 2 foot or 3 foot of it, or 10? Like, I'm just wondering, can we excavate out the soil, or is it that deep, Martin, that you can't do it?
Generally can't.
And there's no way of getting the surface water out of it, like,
Chair, if I might just suggest that part of the code is about doing a site characterisation, so you have to look at every site on its own merits and its own depth.
Okay, Martin wants to come back in there. Sorry.
Just a small point on that. Like in general, you have a shallow topsoil, and then you come into, which we often call it daub. It's almost like plasticine you used to use in school long ago. That's what it's like, and you could go to, in some cases, 8 to 10 feet of that before you come into an actual gravelly subsoil. And some places you'd have less of that. But it is very, very difficult environment to try and do anything with. But that has an impact not just for one-off housing, but for a whole range of things. Because it had an impact for, like people mentioned about E. coli and all of that. Like and the point has often been made to me by people in the planning department, where they'd go in and they'd look at a site of 2 acres and they'd say, look, there's nowhere on that site you can build a house. And then the person would drive past it 2 months later, and the farmer would be after spreading to several tanks of slurry on the same piece of land. Which obviously has impermeable soil, because it can't, and the question would be in the head, well, I mean, what's going on here, you know? So and that issue, I imagine, will have an impact as well on our whole issue of E. coli and all of that, when you have, you know, the whole agricultural sector. We also have vast amount of forestry in Leitrim, and again, the runoff from all of that, like I'm sure Joseph, what would the 3 main issues of pollution come from? In Leitrim, I would imagine that one-off rural housing would not be in the top 3, if even in the top 10.
Okay, I think that wraps it up. I would like to thank all our witnesses for attending today and engaging with the committee, and I propose we suspend the meeting for a few moments. Thank you all very much.
Don't have to read that out again. Okay. Okay, item number 8 on the agenda is detailed scrutiny of the Social Housing Bill 2016, and I would like to welcome to today's meeting Deputy Eoin Ó Broin, who will be making his opening statement or opening remarks.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to members of the committee, particularly those who have been supporting the bill to date. And I also just want to acknowledge the very significant body of work done by the Library and Research Service in their briefing paper that accompanies the bill. It's actually a very substantial piece of work and very helpful. Look, this piece of legislation is very simple. It does 3 things. It seeks to increase the Part 5 requirement for standard residential developments to 25% from the currently reduced 10%. It seeks to impose a larger Part 5 requirement in strategic development zones of 30%. But what it also does is it makes one significant wording change from the existing legislation. So not only is it changing the percentages, but it's also changing the wording surrounding them from not more than to at least, which is a significant change for members to be aware of. The arguments are very straightforward. We discuss them week in and week out in this committee. We're not getting a sufficient supply of social housing, notwithstanding the increases that are taking place. There are very, very few affordable housing schemes in the pipeline, and most of those aren't going to start delivering units not till 2020, 21, 22 and 23. And while the government previously stood down the affordable housing schemes, affordable housing is still on the statute, and therefore if you do increase the Part 5 requirement to 25%, for example, that does allow local authorities to make decisions on the basis of an increased supply of affordable housing. And if you combine that, for example, with the Service Sites Fund that's now available to local authorities, you could use this increase to deliver a much more significant increase in affordable rental or affordable purchase accommodation within these developments. The Department have given a statement, and I just want to make a couple of comments on the concerns they have. The first is they are concerned about the change of the wording from not more than to at least. And in particular, their concern is that this could lead to local authorities who don't need more social and affordable housing having to agree to it. I'm not convinced that there are many such local authorities. However, if members were of a view that some flexibility needed to be introduced to ensure that a local authority wasn't forced to take units it didn't need, I'm more than happy to explore that at formal committee stage. But I think what we're hearing from TDs pretty much in every county and local authority is there is an urgent need either for more social and or more social and affordable, and therefore I still think the changing of wording is valid. There is a concern that it will have an impact on the price of properties because obviously developers will have less stock in each development to sell at open market prices. The difficulty, of course, is, as the Goodbody report confirmed earlier this week, we have a lot of housing stock that is currently being built in the wrong place or at the wrong price. And in fact, they've shown that there's a reduction in the number of new purchased units at below prices of 250,000. So in fact, rather than increasing prices, what this would do if the local authority was to choose the option of affordable housing as the increased portion, it would actually increase the volume of affordable housing for people who currently are priced out of the market, and that would be a very important thing. In relation to the strategic development zones, we don't have a large number of these, and the 2 most recent are Poolbeg and Clonburris in my own constituency. In Clonburris, for example, it does have a 30% between the Part 5 and lands that the local authority owns, and that is in the SDZ and has been approved by Bord Pleanála. Likewise, with the Poolbeg Strategic Development Zone, the Dublin City Councillors approved a requirement for 30% in land that is all private, albeit under a NAM-appointed receiver. And while on Bord Pleanála did rule that any such percentage would have to be voluntary because the law doesn't permit it, it still kind of demonstrates the point that strategic development zones are by their nature very strategic in key locations, and therefore they're precisely the locations that you need a higher percentage of social and affordable housing. The idea, for example, that you would have only had 10% in the Poolbeg site makes no sense given the nature of that area. So I do think there needs to be a separate treatment for strategic development zones above the standard requirement. The last point I'll make is this. Look, There were different views expressed by parties who allowed the bill to proceed through second stage, where people were saying that they might like to see a slightly lower increase, so maybe not to 25% but to 20%, and likewise with the SDZs. I'm more than happy to work with any of the deputies and parties or independents to agree a compromise position. The objective here is to get more than 10%, and while I've set out in the bill what I'd like to see at an optimum level, I'm absolutely open to supporting friendly amendments to ensure that the bill proceeds through committee stage and into report stage. And I just want to put it on the record that I'll work with deputies in that regard.
Thanks, Owen. Victor?
First, I want to thank Deputy O'Brien for that brief presentation there, and I also want to join with him and acknowledge the enormous work that on the briefing paper that the Oireachtas Library and Research team have put together. It's a very, very comprehensive. It was circulated to all of us, and it's very, very comprehensive, and it's important that we acknowledge the work. They do an enormous amount of work in here, and they're a wonderful resource to both the committees and to the Dáil and the Shannon. So I've heard what Owen has had to say. I've also read the submission here from the department that was presented to us earlier, or is circulated to us earlier, and I think we need to keep it simple. I mean, I would not have supported the reduction of the Part 5s when it went back from 20% to 10%. And I like to use that broader term of public housing rather than social housing. I think it's public housing, be it for affordable purposes or whatever purposes. It's public housing, and I like that concept. And therefore, and I hear also what you're saying in relation to the strategic development zones. I'm particularly familiar with the one in Cherrywood there, and there isn't a lot of state lands, a lot of lands that are held by the private developers out there. So SDZs are different by nature wherever they are in terms of location. And I think we'd be doing really, really well if we could reverse the down to the 10% back to 20%. I think that's practical, it's reasonable, it's something we had before. I'm not all convinced. I was looking at an application that's just been granted by the board in relation to a development in South County Dublin the other day. And again, we're seeing the clustering of the social or the affordable housing, and not necessarily to the best aspects of the sites. Many of them facing single aspect facing north. So I have really concerns about that. I'd like to see strengthened legislation in terms of a more equal and fair distribution of units right across a particular complex. I don't like the idea or the suggestion even that maybe they are slightly substandard or not the same quality of build, or the aspect as a single aspect. They'd be concerns I'd have generally about it, but I think if we could get a 10% social and 10% affordable, I think it would be good, it would be positive, and I think we have to be incremental, because if you read what the department is saying, they raise a whole load of issues about stability in the market. This is all settling in now, we're seeing these units coming on stream. Standard sentences that we've heard, and I'm not, you know, I don't want to rubbish them all together. Yes, they have legitimate concerns about stability in the market, and things we're seeing an increased peak in outputs in terms of delivery of housing across all sectors and by all different types of providers. So, in general, I support it, and I really want to congratulate you and all the people involved in this piece of legislation. And I would be more of the view, if we can reverse the 10% back to 20%, I think it'd be a very, very good day's work.
Thanks, Victor.
Yeah, I'll be fairly brief on where we stand on this. We've supported it to this stage, and we will continue to support it. We have reservations in relation to the percentages. I think Darragh has outlined that to you. And we have issues about trying to apply it retrospectively to existing permissions. We would have concerns in relation to that. I do think there is an opportunity, taking this piece of legislation and the fact that we've just passed our regional plans and our national plans, that all our county development plans now have to fall into sync in line with this. So it does give us an opportunity in the review of all our county development plans to take this type of legislation into account when we're doing that, so there can be no ambiguity about it, and it's clearly on the line there. But just listen, you know where we stand. We have always been a supporter of the 20%. We introduced it originally, and we stand over that, and we have been looking for a new year. We have concerns about the percentages that you're looking for, but we're willing to work with you on it.
Yeah, just extremely briefly on this. We would be supporting this bill. The point that's come up for discussion here is the question of, do you reverse and go back from 10 to 20, or do you go beyond that, which this bill does do? You need to go beyond it. I mean, we had 20% when there wasn't a housing crisis in this country. We've now got the greatest housing crisis in the history of the state. I think 25% is should not go below that. We'll be supporting.
Owen, do you want to come back on anything?
Yeah, just very briefly. First of all, thanks members for the support, and again, just to emphasise, if there's a consensus position emerging for a particular percentage, notwithstanding the fact that, like Mick, I prefer the percentages that are here, I'll work with that, and I give that commitment very clearly. It's not legally possible to apply these retrospectively. Planning permissions that have previously been granted will be developed out with their existing, so this is about future developments. And again, just, I suppose, to emphasise the point about affordable housing, if you look on page 12 on the Library and Research's paper, they give a really good table, actually, of Part 5 developments in the breakdown of social and affordable from 2002 to 2018. And you can see there, particularly 2006 to 2008, affordable housing was the larger portion of those. And again, I just want to emphasise, because we had a really good meeting with officials from the department, the NDFA and 2 local authorities on affordable housing, and the members that were here will know those projects aren't going to start delivering a significant yield of affordable units for some years. We will get some in Dunleary next year, but it will be the years after that in Dublin City and elsewhere. And therefore, for those members that are really keen to see affordable rental or affordable purchases coming on stream more quickly, this is the only route to do that that's on the table. The last point is and Victor mentioned it, I did get a wry smile, and I'll say this to Paul when he speaks later. The last paragraph of the department's presentation talked about fresh policy uncertainty. One of the things the construction industry keeps giving out to the government about is the fact that they keep changing the rules. And I'm not saying that the department is necessarily wrong. Some of them I agree with, some of them I don't. But the point is, if a policy change has a positive outcome, particularly for people who are unable to access social or affordable housing now, then it's one that's worth making. But I think you make it and then you stick to it for a period of time. And I think most of the committee are of the view that it's not like we're going to look to come back to this at a later stage. If we pass it and proceed, then industry will know that's where it's going to stay for the future.
No more questions? Okay. So I propose we suspend the meeting just for a few minutes to allow our witnesses to take their seats. Is that agreed? Thanks. At the request of Broadcasting and Recording Services, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting, their mobile phones are turned off completely or switched to airplane safe or flight mode, depending on their device. It is not sufficient to just put your phones in silent mode, as this will maintain a level of interference with the broadcasting system. Item number 9 on the agenda today is detailed scrutiny of the Social Housing Bill 2016. I would like to welcome to today's meeting officials from the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government, Ms Caroline Timmins, Ms Marion O'Driscoll and Mr Paul Hogan. Before we begin, I'd just like to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 172I of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence given to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter, you are entitled To continue to so do, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way to make him or her identifiable. I would now like to call on Ms Caroline Timmins to make your opening statement.
I'd like to thank the Chair and the Joint Committee for inviting the Department to discuss the Social Housing Bill 2016, which concerned what is commonly known as Part 5 of the Planning and Development Act 2000. I'm accompanied today by Paul Hogan, Principal Advisor, Planning, and Marion O'Driscoll, Assistant Principal in the Housing Policy Unit. The bill as proposed intends to amend Section 94 of the Planning and Development Act 2000 so that Section 94 would essentially provide that at least 20% of the land zoned for residential use or a mixture of residential and other uses would be reserved for the provision of social and affordable housing. In addition, it proposes a new subsection to be added which would increase that 25% to at least 30% in a special development zone, which would be a strategic development zone. This bill was originally debated in the Dáil in November 2018, and the position in relation to the bill has not changed. This is a time for stability and certainty in this policy area in order to foster housing supply, and unnecessary change which could affect both supply and house prices should be avoided. There are a number of issues with the bill, both substantive and technical, that deserve close consideration by the committee. It should be noted that the bill is not a straightforward return to the language of the original Planning and Development Act 2000. The original Act referred to a percentage of not more than 20%, whereas the current bill goes much further and proposes that at least 25% or at least 35% in a special development zone must be acquired by the local authority, thereby placing obligations on the local authority to acquire at least 25% or 35%. This obligation would persist whether or not the local authority requires the land or the housing units in that given area, without further consideration of appropriateness from a financial or integration perspective, and without any clear analysis of whether and how such a sudden significant policy change as this would affect housing supply or house prices in the short or medium term. The committee has referred to the fact that this policy was previously comprehensively reviewed and that the review included a public consultation based on a report prepared by economic consultants. In the context of this review, a detailed assessment of Part 5 requirements was undertaken, including the benefits that Part 5 had in relation to social integration. The review had regard to the changed economic circumstances and the changed circumstances in terms of housing supply. It considered that the principle of integrated mixed tenure developments was positive from a housing policy perspective and therefore recommended the retention of Part 5 as a concept. It urged that Part 5 be focused on the delivery of social housing and therefore recommended the lowering of the requirement from 20 to 10%. Following this review, a number of amendments were made to Part 5 by way of the Urban Regeneration and Housing Act 2015. While the developer's contribution was reduced from 20% to 10% of the planning gain, the amount by which the site increased in value as a result of having obtained planning permission, the previous position, which enabled the developer to make a financial contribution instead of selling land or units to local authorities, was repealed. Also, the developer was henceforth required to conclude a Part 5 agreement before commencing construction. It was considered that this would copper-fasten the original objective of Part 5 in the legislation, that is, the delivery of social housing, combined with integration and sustainable mixed-tenure communities across the country. It should be noted that local authorities were informed that they should seek to secure social housing units only, rather than affordable housing under Part 5. It is considered that the amendments made to Part 5 in 2015 were fair and balanced. It is also a relatively short time since those amendments were made. In relation to unintended consequences, it is entirely foreseeable that increasing the percentage to be set aside for social housing now would likely lead to an increase in private house prices, as developers would likely seek to protect their overall profit margins. Such an unintended consequence would be seriously problematic in the current housing climate, where we are finally seeing a moderation in price increases. It is also not considered appropriate to require a higher percentage in an SDZ, which would require a higher contribution from a developer carrying out residential development in an SDZ, as opposed to a developer carrying out residential development elsewhere, with no underlying policy rationale. Again, the local authorities should have the ability to make informed decisions based on the local need as to whether to acquire more housing in an SDZ without risking overall viability. The supply of new housing in Ireland last year reached a 9-year high of over 18,000. Indicators so far are positive that this will increase in 2019. Having regard to the range of schemes and programmes that the Government have put in place to facilitate the accelerated delivery of social housing and affordable homes, including from state land, and mindful of the fact that the housing sector generally is still very much in a state of ongoing recovery, with a considerable journey yet to travel before a more balanced and stable housing market will be achieved, it is not considered appropriate to raise the current 10% Part 5 requirement to 25% at this time. It is a time for stability in order to foster growth in supply, and when supply has reached the required levels, and then the policy can be appropriately reviewed again. It should be noted, of course, that there is nothing to prevent local authorities acquiring further units in a development beyond those delivered under Part 5, subject to being satisfied that this is appropriate in terms of sustainable community objectives and subject to funding provided by the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government. This provides an appropriate level of flexibility whereby the local authority can acquire housing or indeed stimulate development in targeted areas. While much has been achieved since 2015 in terms of recovery in their housing sector, there is still a considerable way to go, both in terms of achieving the level of supply that would be more reflective of a balanced housing supply situation, and also in terms of achieving a recovery in supply that is more geographically spread. Much of the recovery in scheme-type home building has been concentrated in Dublin, the Greater Dublin area and Cork. The policies that have been put in place over the last number of years have played a major part in the recovery that has taken place, and it is essential at this stage that there is policy stability and certainty if the recovery is to continue in the desired manner. Now is not the time to introduce fresh policy uncertainty into the area by increasing or reintroducing costs and liabilities on the provision of housing, as to do so would foreseeably adversely impact the viability and therefore deliverability of housing in a market where viability, particularly in terms of housing at affordable price points, remains finely balanced in many areas and has yet to be restored in some parts of the country.
Thanks, Caroline. Owen?
Thank you very much, and Caroline, thank you very much for the presentation. I'll make a couple of points and then just ask a couple of quick questions. First of all, in relation to the SDZs, or indeed in terms of voluntary agreements and standard residential developments, there is something stopping local authorities agreeing those, and that's that developers don't have to enter into those agreements if they don't so wish. So the whole point of, I suppose, increasing it is to make it a viable option. Dublin City Council, as you know, voted to have essentially a 29% social affordable requirement in the Poolbeg SDZ, and the receiver appealed it to An Bord Pleanála, and effectively kind of won the core point of his appeal, which is such an agreement would have to be voluntary. Now, that's now working itself out, but it's going to cost the state a significant amount of money to purchase the land. It would have been much better if An Bord Pleanála had the legislative foundation to uphold the original Dublin City Council decision. So that's why I think there really is a need to have some increase, whether it's 30% or 20%, as others have suggested, within the STZs. The other thing is we are seeing developers at the current time entering into voluntary agreements. Paul will know, for example, out in Shackleton in his former job in South Dublin County Council, developers of very significant projects, because of the difficulty of accessing bank finance, are quite open to voluntary agreements because that gives them a certain degree of additional security when they go into the banks. So actually, there's an argument to say that making this a more secure option could actually assist some of those projects being developed at a faster level. I mean, I do have a concern. One of the outcomes of the review in 2013, 2014 was the reduction to 10%. Now, there's a growing body of social policy evidence to say that actually 10% is too small in terms of any possibility of integration of the very small number of lower income households in a larger private housing estate. And that while nobody has the answer to what is the appropriate level to encourage the integration which government policy promotes, there is no evidence to suggest that 10% is high enough. And in fact, there are bodies of evidence from Britain, from Australia and the US, and some research here that shows that in fact 10% is too small and contributes to isolation of lower income households within a larger housing development. I suppose my questions are as follows. Obviously, you're absolutely correct in terms of the significant changing of the wording, and that's a correct interpretation of my intention. So my question is, do you know of any local authorities that currently don't need an increase of social and affordable housing? Because all of the local authorities we're talking to have housing lists and have affordable housing needs greater than the level of supply that's there. The second question, I suppose, is in terms of the potential increase in price in the remainder of the development. I mean, again, I made the remark, I think, before you came in, the Good Body report published earlier this week highlights the fact that, in fact, too much of what's being built is at an above affordable price point. and therefore surely if you have an increased Part 5 requirement, it means there will be a greater level of affordability for those people who currently can't buy in developments with only the 10%. And in terms of the policy uncertainty, I mean, we're going to have a series of other changes. For example, the Committee on Climate Action is going to have to look at changes in terms of building regulations. The near zero energy building requirements, as again Paul and yourself rightly know, are going to create. So we are going to have a period of policy uncertainty. What we know for sure is we don't have enough social and affordable housing, and this is one way of increasing that. So, I mean, the government can't say we're going to have lots of uncertainty because of the initiatives the Minister wants to introduce, but at the same time criticise opposition for creating alleged uncertainty because the opposition wants to introduce those things. I mean, there's going to be uncertainty over the next period of time, and I think so long as it's well flagged and then is left at that level for a period of time, I think industry will adequately cope.
Thank you. I'll bring in my colleague, Mr. Hogan, after a few minutes, but I might just start with the last point. I think you said this is one way of increasing it, and of course the flaw in the logic is that simply setting percentage does not automatically increase the level of social housing that you receive. You could set it at 100%, and you still won't receive any social housing because simply no one will be able to supply it. You'll affect development and you'll put a choke on supply. So what I think this doesn't address is what's going to be the impact on supply in the short to medium term, and there's no analysis of that. If we look back at what was being developed, say, in the years where the bust happened in 2008 and 2009, we saw that the supply under Part 5 came from, say, 4,518, which was the height of it, and it went right down to 36 in 2016. So the percentage does not automatically mean you get more. That's a flaw in your logic. It simply means that that's what you want. It doesn't mean that the developer will provide it. It doesn't mean that the supply will happen. What we're looking at here is increasing a percentage and effectively not knowing will the supply be able to happen, because people have bought the land at those prices. They've bought the land already, and they're looking at doing these houses in the next 2 years, and we're saying we absolutely want them to do that. And now we're saying we're going to change the rules now, though, so you have to give us more. You go back to your bank and tell them, no, I'm sorry, we'll have to actually look at that again. So, A, most definitely we'll get a delay, if anything else. And B, we could actually negatively affect the supply. And I think your reference to the Goodbye report is very apt, because that shows how very finely balanced things are right now. We're really on the precipice. Are we going up and are we down? The SRI are still saying we're going to hit about 25,000, and that's really important that we keep that momentum maintained. And I wouldn't accept the point that there's instability in policy anyway, therefore we should have more, because it doesn't matter. Of course it matters. It matters that we don't do any more instability than we absolutely have to. I think the Minister accepted in his second stage speech that once the supply reaches a level of around something that's maintainable and sustainable, and possibly around the 35,000 mark, he would look at that again. I think that's a very fair and balanced position, that once we see supply coming back to the levels we really need, then you'd look at, well, are we getting enough out of this? Could we get more? And I think that's a really reasonable position. It was a really reasonable thing we did back in 2000 to say that we wanted to get more, and during the boom to get more. But now we're not in that space. It's a very different economic reality. And making decisions to change things when we've said in the review, this is what we're going to do. In fact, your last point, I think, Deputy, was really precise, because you said we should then stick to it for a little while. What we're doing is sticking to it for a little while, making sure that we don't affect things, give a little bit of stability, and then once we've gotten to a position where we have stability, then we can make changes again. So I think you're right about that it is about providing certainty to the market, about if you've bought it at this price, we're not going to change the game on you immediately, and that you get your supply out, which is what we're asking for. I think it's also wrong to say that we're not going to get social and affordable any other way. Of course local authorities need them, but this is why we're looking at other ways to do that. And we're using public lands to do that, which I think you're very much in support of as well. And we're also looking at the measures like the Service Sites Fund, looking at measures like LIHAP, looking at the affordable purchase homes, looking at rebuilding our home loans, all these levers that we know will accelerate and increase supply. But this is a lever that very manifestly could, in fact, choke supply and decrease supply. So you've got to use the ones that we can bet on and that are actually safe bets, whereas this one, there's a really clear possible unintended consequence that can happen here. At a minimum, it will be delay, and at a maximum, it could actually decrease supply. So given how much that might affect rents, I think, in the market, we really have to be very clear that we have the evidence base to make a policy decision like this. And I wouldn't consider we have that evidence base before us to make that type of policy decision right now. But it would be something that we would look at again when the time is right to check that that's something we would like to do. I might bring in my colleague on the strategic development zones as well, Paul, as a planner, and would have more expertise on that.
Yeah, I think the issue is the kind of one-fits-all size nature of the proposal in that, you know, a strategic development zone is a geographic planning designation. It's a spatially unique thing. It applies to one place, and it's for a specified set of purposes. So each one of those needs to be considered in a local context as opposed to subjected to a kind of a very high level of overall national provision. And the other point is that not all SDZs are for housing, and again, you know, this is a point that needs to be taken on board. Some include some housing, or could include some housing at the point of designation. It's not always specified. So, you know, you take for example the Grange Gorman SDZ for the Technical University Dublin. Waterford North Keys is another example of one that's current, where, you know, it could be entirely commercial, but it could also include some housing. We don't know for sure. It depends on what comes forward. We've a current draft for Knock Airport, for example, which probably won't have any, and a proposing a sort of emerging proposal for University of Limerick that could include some, but again, that's, you know, that's down the line. So the real point here is it's not one size fits all, and it's a very high threshold, 35% as proposed. So it would be inappropriate to single out and prejudge how an SDZ can be approached locally, you know, given the intended purpose of an SDZ. And then just the final point of this is that SDZs are intended to be, particularly in the case of housing, a strategic approach to planning, whereby the kind of the normal sort of uncertainties and things in the system are kind of set aside, and there's a clearer, more certain route to volume delivery of housing. You know, the likes of Adamstown, Clonburris, Cherrywood fit into that. So applying this kind of differential standard would, you know, all of which would have to be negotiated in advance as well prior to the commencement of construction, would, you know, for a whole variety of reasons, you know, obviously viability comes into it as well, would simply render SDZs unattractive vis-a-vis other development routes where a lower figure would apply. So it would effectively kill off any new SDZ proposals in the future. I mean, that would be the concern. Just a final point as well on I think the first question about local authorities that don't need social and affordable. Well, obviously we know that there's an element of it required everywhere, but the point here is that it's simply not viable to build scheme housing in approximately half the counties in the country. I mean, you know, possibly more, to be honest. I mean, it's not entirely county specific, but the routes, you know, one of the reasons why, particularly in rural Ireland, you know, one-off housing in the countryside is so popular is because it's a possible route for people to house themselves and to meet their housing needs. So, you know, the margins are very fine, and there's a lot of talk about county development plans and the need to sort of be sustainable and provide an element of choice in terms of urban housing. But if it's simply not viable to do scheme housing, it's unlikely that we will achieve, you know, even the modest 10% target that we have, and that has to be seen as the baseline from which, you know, further units can be acquired in the future. But we won't see any of it, I think, if we make it even more difficult than it is to deliver housing through Part 5.
Thanks, Paul. Mick, we'll do another round on. Mick?
Yeah, Chair, I'm going to be brief. I think the starting point for this discussion, we shouldn't take it as a given. We should remind ourselves, is the greatest housing crisis in the history of the state, a housing emergency, more than 10,000 people officially homeless, and a generation that have been, in large measure, locked out of the housing market. Every serious analyst, every serious think tank, commentator, well, I won't say every, but almost without exception, are arguing now that the increase in a supply of social housing is key to dealing with the crisis. So I think, you know, there's been talk about we need to provide certainty to the markets, etc., etc. The starting point for me, we need to provide certainty to people who are being locked out of the market, and we need to provide certainty for people who are on the housing waiting lists and who are in homeless and emergency accommodation at the moment. So I'm listening to the points that have been raised about unintended consequence, etc. But I think if we're talking about evidence base, the first bit of evidence that we should have put before the committee is not what might happen if we go down this road, but what is happening at the moment. So my question, I don't have the stats to hand and I would like to have them for this discussion, is let's take the last 3 years, 2016, 2017, 2018. What have local authorities, what has the state received in terms of new social housing units on the basis of Part 5? Against the context of a massive housing crisis, what have we got? What's the evidence? What are the numbers? That's the question. Thanks.
Do you want to come in?
They would gather anyway from the previous round that we would be supporting this Owen's bill. We have reservations about the percentages, and we've spoken to Owen on that directly. But we are fully behind the trust of changing the Part 5 back to a minimum of 20%, which will indeed include affordable homes. And I think we haven't delivered an affordable home for a long time, and there's no affordable scheme either at the moment. So affordability is a key issue for us. I don't have, Caroline, when you say, you know, people bought the land and they need certainty, I don't buy that at all. The department had no problem in county development plans completely dezoning land that had been bought. Just wholesale across the country, you've gone and dezoned land. Didn't cost you a thought. So I don't think the fact that somebody has bought land should be a concern of the department in relation to Part 5. I don't understand that logic at all. You know, you say, and the other thing is, specifically in relation to Wicklow, most developers are selling nearly 100% of their development to the Department for Social Housing anyway. So why is the issue all of a sudden of raising it by 10 or 15% or whatever that is, should be a concern to the developer who bought the land already, when it didn't concern you in previous years, when you were dezoning land or when you were changing the criteria for land zoning. And that's still ongoing. I mentioned in the last round, I think this is an apt time to bring this in. We have the National Planning Framework, we have the regional plans, and we now, most counties will have to do a complete review of their county development plans based on the regional plans. And with this in mind, I think it is the ideal opportunity. Sometimes I wonder whether we should look at all development and say a percentage should be built to rent, a percentage should be affordable, a percentage should be for first-time buyers, and a percentage should be for social. And is that where we need to get to as a country? And should that be a policy moving forward, that all aspects of housing need is met with a planning application? Anyway, they're just basically a few points on that. I just think this thing about unintended consequences to a developer, listen, I don't buy that at all. No, and I have no, I mean, when you say, you know, they've bought the land, I don't think that's a reason not to look at this as a logical policy moving forward.
Owen, do you want to come back in on this round?
Just a couple of things. Again, look, Paul and Caroline, thanks for your responses. And I mean, just to, I suppose, to reassure you, I take all of the points very seriously, and I appreciate the time that you've taken to consider them. I'll say a couple of things, though. I absolutely agree with you. We need an evidence base, and we do need to be mindful of unintended consequences, so I'm not disregarding either of those. But I've read the 2012 DMK report, which underpinned the review of Part 5 in 2013 and 2014. I didn't see any evidence in that to support the reduction. There were assumptions, and there were assessments, and there were opinions. And while obviously it's only 4.5 years 5 years really, it didn't lead to any immediate response from the market. Now, of course, it was never going to lead to any immediate response in the market in terms of increasing Part 5 because where the construction sector was at that stage. But given the fact that the reduction, in my view, wasn't evidence-based, I think it is reasonable for us to argue that whether it's a return to 20 or 25 or 30% is something that should be possibly explored. I also think some of the language Caroline and Paul have used is interesting. So it would choke supply. Right? That's a pretty significant statement. And I suppose my question to you is, what evidence do you have that you believe it would choke supply? And Paul, and this is even probably more extreme, it would kill off SDZs. I doubt you really believe that, right? But obviously that's what you've said at the committee, so I'll take it at face value. But one of the big criticisms of the Docklands SDZ is there was virtually no social affordable housing in real terms there. One of the things we've seen with Poolbeg is a real desire on the part of residents and the vast majority of elected members of Dublin City Council to have affordability. In fact, even the Minister, both Simon Coveney and then Owen Murphy, wanted to have that 30%. And SDZs are of such huge importance because they are always in key locations. And one of the challenges in those key locations, of course, is affordability is always going to be a real challenge because of their proximity to economic opportunities and public transport hubs, etc. So actually, I think it's because of the strategic nature of them that you need a higher percentage. But again, I'm willing to work with committee members to respond to that. So all I would say is if our biggest challenge at the moment is the undersupply of affordable housing, and all of the information we have from the department and the local authorities is there isn't going to be a significant supply of affordable housing through Service Sites Fund or LIHAF or whatever for 4 to 5 years. Asking us to wait until we reach 30 to 35,000 total completions and then review it. The difficulty is by that time we'll have produced so many unaffordable private sector units that the affordable housing crisis will have got worse, if not at least remained static. So I still think there is a compelling argument to do this. Do I genuinely think that by introducing this we are going to delay output? I genuinely don't, and I've yet to see any evidence for it. But if you have any evidence, I'd be more than happy to consider it and rethink my position.
So, Caroline?
I think, a lot of the arguments made, they're very fair points. But there's quite a circular argument going on that it's reasonable to say that, well, I proposed this, but you should provide the evidence that it's not true. So I think that that's quite a difficulty for us to be asked to prove the negative, where, in fact, you should be showing us what's the evidence to say that it would work, I would have said. And there is none put before us, so we can't consider it, and that's a difficulty for me. It's also another issue if you start saying that, well, there was no evidence to do what we did the last time and reduce it, so we don't need evidence to do it this time. That's also a difficult argument for me to accept, and that's with great respect. It's simply something that, if we say that we should just go back to the way we were without evidence that that won't have unintended consequences, that it won't, and I can say it would justify, it could, and that's a very real, foreseeable possibility. We should have something that says, actually, no, it won't. We're absolutely, or at least reasonably certain it won't. A decent economic analysis that says, no, there's a reason that would, because the man in the street would tell you, if you start changing the game, that you have to go back to your bank, you have to go back to your financiers, and you have to say that things have changed, I now have to sell them the land at this particular price, or the units back to the local authority, and that changes my financial model. That's reasonable to assume. So if you're going to say that that's not reasonable to assume, you need to show why that isn't the case. The other point to that is, I think that you're saying that, of course, local authorities are acquiring in some areas, and in Wicklow, you're absolutely right. Local authorities have the flexibility to do that. If they think in a given area that they want to acquire those units, they now have the flexibility to do that, and that's the beauty of the system. If you say they must acquire, and that's what this legislation says, they must acquire in a given area, you've removed all flexibility for them to say, in fact, you know what, there's enough social housing here. I think you've brought up those particular pieces of research which we have been looking at in the department. And you're saying that it's saying 10% is enough, but it's not 10% removed from everything outside it. All of these places are connected to someplace else. And what local authorities need to be doing is, how much is in the broader area that we're looking at? Because if you simply looked at one simple development, that's not a fine-grained assessment of the situation. Look at what the percentage is around the development. So if you're simply saying, I don't care what's around it, you're simply going to do 25% and it doesn't matter what you want. That's making them spend money where they might not agree that you should be spending, and it's a significant amount of money, because these units might be in an area where they're quite expensive, and you're saying that I give you no flexibility to make that decision. For a developer, it's also a flexibility of decision making. I think it's really important that they are actually able to say to local authorities, this would assist me in my model, I can do this, and this actually assists, and that's great, and if that works for everybody, wonderful. But the developer should also say, actually, if I do this, I can't actually supply this at all. It doesn't work for my financial model. I don't want to do this. That's also a point that they have to take into account. So we have to understand it might not always work for them, and if it does, that's great, and it works for everybody. So I suppose those would be the points I'd make back to you, and I hope I've addressed kind of the points you're making logically. If there's anything else Paul has to say?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying in relation to the big statement about killing off STZs, but I think it just, you know, all I'm saying is if you assume that, you know, an STZ there has to be an element of voluntary motivation to act here, you know, so I'm talking about the assumption that developers, landowners will act rationally, and if there is a very significant differential, you know, for those areas of land, there's a disincentive to act to secure the designation, to wish to develop in such an area, and you know, to pursue the objectives of an STZ. So, you know, the likelihood is that it does eliminate any advantage, or certainly one of the key advantages that there would be.
Thanks, Chair.
Number of units delivered the last 3 years.
Yes, certainly I can address that if that's okay, Chair. Sorry, this is available on the Department Statistics page on our website. We have all of the units delivered from 2002 to 2018. In 2016, there were 36 units acquired under Part 5. In 2017, it was 522, and in 2018, it was 841. If you want a copy of that, we can provide it to you, but it's available on the website, and it does show you, it breaks back down the levels of affordable housing when we had that, the local authorities, voluntary and cooperative, so it goes into those numbers, which I think is useful to see. You can see that the output went severely down over the years. We had about 9,000 total over the last, since that provision came in. The output went up significantly up to 2009, and then there's a severe drop-off after 2009, right back to 36 in 2016, which is the lowest that we had. So we haven't seen Part 5, despite the fact that there's 10% there, we've never seen it getting back up to the level we needed to be at. So those are the figures, and I hope that's useful.
Thanks, Karen. It's also in the library research. I don't know if you have that, Mick, on page 12. I think Owen alluded to it. Any more questions? No. Okay. Can I thank Ms Caroline Timmins, Ms Marion O'Driscoll and Paul Young for attending today and for the ongoing information that they share. I would like to thank all our witnesses and obviously the author of the bill, Deputy O'Brien. I would like to thank all our witnesses for their cooperation. This meeting is now adjourned sine die. Thanks.